Jessica Love is an author and illustrator based in Brooklyn, New York. Jess was raised by artist parents in Southern California, where she studied printmaking and illustration before going on to study acting in New York. Her debut picture book, Julian is a Mermaid, is a beautiful story about self-confidence, love and celebrating individuality. We were thrilled to catch up with Jessica on her recent visit to the UK, where she met with Nikki Gamble to talk about her work and future plans.
I was really interested to read, Jessica, that you grew up with art in the family, artistic parents. Were they practicing professional artists?
They are. That is their full-time job. My mom is a basket weaver, and my dad is a potter. And they work in organic found materials, and their work is collaborative. They have a studio behind our house. I grew up in the middle of the Los Padres National Forest in Southern California. They have a little cabin, and that's where my sister was born. It's where I grew up, and their studio is just out back.
Okay. It sounds idyllic. I mean, what did, as a young child growing up, what sort of impact did that have on you, that very creative, working with your hands, crafting environment?
Oh, it shaped me, absolutely. And because they worked from home, I was able to, they were around a lot, and, you know, they would just roll me out a big sheet of butcher paper and toss some markers my way, and I was good to go. All I wanted to do was draw.
So it sounds like it afforded a lot of freedom.
Yeah.
And freedom is a sense that comes through quite strongly in Julian, which we'll come to in a little while. But you then pursued art yourself, didn't you, as a training?
I did. I had an art scholarship, so I was a studio art major, but my plan was actually to be, at the time, was to be an actor. I've always done visual art and plays sort of side by side. So I was an art major, but I was doing plays, and I was in a comedy troupe, and that's what I spent most of my focus on when I was in undergrad. And then I went to grad school at Juilliard in New York for drama, and that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years, I guess. Yeah.
So I'm interested in, again, which I think will feed into us talking about the picture book, I'm interested in the two things that you studied alongside each other, words and non-words. Mm-hmm. I was talking to a poet yesterday who has written in one of his novels that art is important for expressing the emotions where words fail. I don't know if you agree with that, or how you see the words and images working together.
I completely agree. I love language. My grandfather was a poetry professor, and there's a great love of language in my family. But the way that I create story is very visual. I understand it in pictures. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a kind of proto-language access to someone's inner life that you can get at with a picture, that it provides a really useful shortcut, I think. You can have whatever opinions or prejudices that you have accumulated over the years, but when you see a picture, a photograph or a drawing of someone's face and they're in pain, there's something that happens in our brain where we recognize that feeling, and for a second we have a flash of it in our own brain and body. I mean, there's science to back this up, right? Mirror neurons.
Yeah.
But I think there's a really interesting shortcut that visual art allows for.
Isn't it interesting, though? Because it is ironic that, here we're recording for a podcast and I'm going to try and get you to verbalise all that. And we do the same with children in school. It's as though it has value once we try to get them to articulate and to verbalise it, rather than the mark making itself being the thing that is possibly the most potent. and
it's
important.
It's the most direct, I think. If you want to address a child directly, through a book, and sort of sidestep the parent or the educator completely, you can use pictures, and they get it.
So it's a fascinating background. So it would be interesting to know then what your journey was to creating a picture book for children.
I had been working as an actor, living in New York and doing plays, traveling around the States, working regionally, doing new plays and some classic stuff, but like a jobbing actor. And I met someone on a play, we fell in love, and he had an older brother who was born a girl. He's a trans man, but he had been living his life as a woman, because when he first tried to come out, he just didn't feel he had the network or the support to do it at the time, and so he had been living a performance of himself for the last 25, 30 years. And when my ex and I first got together, he had just transitioned to living as a man. And it got me curious about, because some of the questions he was faced with were like, how are we supposed to explain this to the children in your life? Are we just supposed to tell them that their aunt is now their uncle? Which actually is a pretty lucid way of explaining it. Kids, all aspects of the world are equally banal and incredible when you're little, and so I think a simple explanation works as well as anything else. But it just got me curious about what kind of books there were out there for little kids grappling with these questions. And I started reading all these online forums where parents from all over the States would talk about their gender nonconforming children. And another thing that was sort of influencing this is I was watching a lot of RuPaul's Drag Race and the documentary Paris is Burning, which is about the drag ball scene in New York in the 1980s. It's a really stunning piece of filmmaking, and it's a glimpse into a world that I wasn't familiar with, but I was deeply moved by. And I got this idea for a story in which a little boy has an encounter on the subway, or the tube, as you call it, because, and I don't know if this is the case here, but in New York, the subway kind of functions as this portal through which you get to encounter every kind of person that lives in New York City, which really is every kind of person. And everyone's all crammed together, and it's an incredible opportunity to have your worldview broadened. So I knew I wanted the encounter to take place in the subway, and at first my idea was that he would see a pair of drag queens on their way to a drag ball. But then as I was reading all of these blogs and forums, there was this theme that kept coming up again and again of the kids having this thing about mermaids. And I think there are a variety of theories as to why that is. They're magical creatures. They live between two worlds.
The hair's quite important.
The hair is very important. And there's nothing below the waist to make that determination for you. But also they're awesome. So there's an event in New York City at the beginning of each summer. It's been going on for decades now, I think, called the Coney Island Mermaid Parade.
Oh, right.
And it's an artist parade where people will spend the whole year working on their costumes, and it's incredibly creative. People from all walks of life show up, covered in glitter and channeling their inner sea being.
And is this participated in by all gender?
All genders, all walks of life, all ages. It's a really beautiful, awesome thing. And it's also in Coney Island, which I know that most of your listeners probably have never been, but it's an iconic New York boardwalk, and it's a little bit like grungy, gritty, and it's a real taste of the city in all its dirty glory.
So this is located very specifically then. Julian as a Mermaid is located with that in mind.
Yeah, it is. So that's what that parade at the end of the book is. But I don't think you really need to know that to go with the story. But yeah, it is a real thing.
Perhaps we should actually tell people a little bit about Julian as a Mermaid before we hone in on some of the detail.
It starts, he and his Nana are at her water aerobics class at the gym, and he's swimming underwater while she's exercising. And they leave the gym and they go into the subway, and he's reading his little picture book about mermaids because he loves mermaids. And onto the train step these 3 gorgeous ladies who are dressed as mermaids on their way to the parade, and his jaw just drops. And as he's staring at them, we sort of enter into his imagination fugue state where the train slowly goes underwater and fills with a swirl of fish, and his hair starts to grow, and his tail emerges, and he's transformed into a mermaid, and then this big indigo star-covered fish approaches him with a necklace that he's about to hang around his neck when his grandmother shakes him out of his reverie, telling him it's their stop. So they get off the train, and he waves bye-bye to the ladies, and as they're walking through the neighborhood in Coney Island, he says, "Did you see the mermaids, Nana?" And she says, "Yeah, I saw them." And they get back to her apartment, and he says, "I'm also a mermaid." And she says, "I'm going to take a bath. You be good." And while she's in the bath, he does what any logical child would do, which is to build himself a mermaid costume out of what's lying around the apartment. So he makes himself a crown out of her sleeping mask, and he pulls fronds out of her fern plant and flowers out of her vase, and he puts on her lipstick, and he pulls down her lacy curtain and makes himself a tail, while simultaneously sort of destroying her apartment. And just as he's completed his look and is posing in the mirror, she comes out and catches him, and there's a moment of doubt where you can't tell if he's...
She looks a bit cross.
Yeah, it's an ambiguous face. You don't know if he's in trouble for destroying the apartment or not, but because she just walks off the page. But then she comes back, and she's all dressed up to go out, and she has something behind her back, and she says, "Come over here." And it's one of her necklaces.
It's a gorgeous moment.
Oh, thank you. She hangs it around his neck, and she takes him by the hand and takes him outside. And he asks where they're going, and she says, "You'll see." And she walks him through the neighborhood, down to the boardwalk, where everybody is rushing to the parade, and left and right you see people dressed as mermaids, octopuses, lobsters, but all dressed up and covered in face paint and glitter, and he's enraptured.
Yeah.
And he says, "Mermaids." And she goes, "Just like you.
Yeah.
Let's join the parade." And then they do. And that's the story.
Wonderful. So you've explained the kind of context for the story and why you wanted to create it. I wonder if we could have a little look at how you went about this, because it's such a gorgeous... I mean, I love these women, and we can see his Nana and 4 ladies, other ladies of a certain age, and they're glorious, but they're not, they're quite large, and these look as though they're drawn from life.
I was going through, when I was doing the final art for this book, I was going through a real heartbreak, and my therapy was I would swim every day, and because I was an actor at the time, I usually had my days free and I was working at night, So I would be swimming at like lunch hour, which also happens to be when the water aerobics classes usually are.
Yes, yeah.
And there was something I found so comforting about sharing this green water with these older, stately beings.
Who can be so graceful in the water. Because water feels like a symbol of freedom in this book.
It is. Water's I grew up by a river, which I lived in during the summer, and I especially loved swimming underwater. I lived my life as a mermaid in the summertime, but I think there's a real privacy that you can get when you're underwater that's different. It really is a different world. It's almost like going into the element of your own inner life. I found it really therapeutic.
So it starts with this gorgeous image. And are these watercolour? Do you use watercolour?
It's watercolor and gouache. So
right, that's why it's a bit stronger.
Yeah, so gouache, for those of you who don't know, it's like watercolor with chalk added. So watercolors are meant to be transparent always, and you can get an opacity with gouache that you can't really achieve with watercolor. So the water and the more opaque tones in the book are gouache, but like the character's skin is watercolor because the paper is already brown. Right. So I would just tone it a little bit.
And does it involve a lot of life drawing for you? Because the movements of these characters look as though you're somebody who draws.
I am someone who draws, but these are all from my imagination. The little boy, Julian is sort of based on my ex, what he looked like as a little boy. But the grandmother, she sort of walked into the room fully formed, but she's not based on anyone in particular.
I'm looking at the double page spread with Julian with his picture book open, and obviously his imagination starts to work. The picture book drops. He's taking off his shirt. He's falling into the water. His hair's expanding, and there's this sense of freedom.
I think there are certain images that are almost mythic, and it's like they exist, I don't know, maybe unconsciously.
You see it so many times in picture books, the kind of falling from one world into another. I like that idea of almost like being a kind of mythic.
Yeah.
Almost like a fairy tale. And the other thing that really struck me, but it's incredibly dynamic, this book. So here I'm looking at a wonderful sweep of fishers. You can tell which direction they're swimming in. They're being led by this terrific ray at the front. And Julian's exuberance, he's just lifting his arms in the air here and going along with the flow.
Yeah.
So movement's quite strong throughout the book. I think there's the falling, there's the wind blowing, the curtains.
I like a thing that I think the more physical an image is, the more you feel it more vividly in your own body. I wanted, with that spread where the fish are swirling around his body, I wanted you for a second to feel that, the way it feels when a fish brushes up against you, and it's exhilarating and a little bit scary. And my hope for the whole story is that because the bodies feel like real bodies with flesh and weight and hair and bones, that it would make empathy a more of a physical experience. Because you can't help but imagine for a second what it would feel like if that were you.
Yeah. In terms of the approach to the book, the text is sparse because it doesn't need to have more in it.
Yeah.
Could it have worked without any text at all, do you think?
No, it could not.
Right.
I'm going to tell you why. So when I first sold the book to Candlewick, I had drawn the book from beginning to end probably 4 times. So the visual journey was pretty complete and hasn't changed that much. It's been refined and condensed, but it was pretty clear what the story was. But I hadn't really done the text yet. And when I sold it, we never really had this conversation, but my editor, Katie Cunningham, was under the impression that it was meant to be a wordless picture book.
Oh.
But we'd never had this conversation. And then just maybe like a month before we went to press, I said something like, we really need to figure out, I need to bang out what this text is actually going to be. And she was like, sorry? This is a wordless picture book. And the reason it can't be wordless is kids assume he's a girl if you don't have... The first sentence in the book is, this is a boy named Julian. And without that, you just assume it's a girl with short hair. I've done a lot of childcare and nannying, and I would, without telling the kids anything about it, I would show them the book without any words, and I would say, tell me what's happening here. And they would say, that's a little girl with her grandmother, and she's a mermaid, and they would talk me through it. But without fail, they would assume that the child was a girl, and that's why you need the text.
It's a really important point in here, and that is that there is a certain freedom afforded to girls in as much as there is a greater variety of common acceptability of,
that's right,
of appearance.
Yeah.
In a way that it's not an issue, that it becomes an issue the other way around for people.
A girl with short hair is going to get fewer side looks than a boy with long hair.
But I also think there's another issue. Given the personal story that you've related here, you've actually chosen a boy rather than a girl. And of course it has to be in a sense for this story. I think that makes sense. But when we're looking for Just Imagine, for books that tell the other story, there's virtually nothing there. I
know. I've noted ever since this book came out, and I've become a little bit more aware of what's out there. That's a thing that I've heard again and again. There's almost nothing. I mean, there's stuff about like girls who want to work in traditionally male-dominated lines of work. You know, Rosie Revere, engineer, or Ada Twist, scientist, and books about tomboys. But in terms of like a trans experience, you're right. There's not much.
Something for us to keep thinking about for definite. And it does strike me that it's important, having worked alongside children in school who can see that is an issue for them, and thinking top end of primary into secondary as their identity is really forming. And I think it actually can manifest itself in quite a lot of anger.
Yeah.
So, you know, I do think we have to be aware of those things. So I wanted to ask you, Jessica, you should be very delighted and proud of the reception that the book is getting. What were you most pleased with when you'd completed the project?
So doing plays, obviously you have a pretty direct and immediate experience of the people that you are doing the work for. They're in the room with you when you're doing it, and you can tell in the moment whether they're with you or not. But with this, I finished the artwork, and then 4 months went by, and then it was finally available for purchase, and people started reaching out to me through Instagram mostly. Parents with kids like Julian saying, our family needed this book. This story is so representative of what our experience is like. And the thing that parents kept saying is the problem with so many of the books that are kind of addressing this experience is it's presented as a problem. And the story is a story of conflict and bullying, which oftentimes, if the child hasn't encountered that yet, it hasn't occurred to them that the way that they are is a problem until they read these stories. And so it was a profound, and continues to be a profound thing, to know that the thing that you've made has ended up in the hands of the people you made it for. And I've never really had that experience before.
I think the other thing that comes from it being non-didactic and quite open is that actually this could represent lots of different kinds of experience. Not every little boy who wants to put on a dress will necessarily go on to be a child that feels that, it's a trans issue for them. There are all sorts of reasons. It's only the way that society is structured that says that we don't. Well, there are plenty of societies where boys do wear dresses and men do wear dresses.
Yeah.
So it's all culturally constructed.
Totally.
So some will go on and it will be coming from that place, but for others it will be coming from a different place.
Yeah.
So we don't really know with Julian. It can be coming from many different places.
I wanted it to be specific enough that it felt real, but not prescriptive.
So now that you're in the world of children's books, are we keeping you? Is there something more coming?
Oh, yeah. I love it here. I'm going to stay as long as you'll have me. Yes, I've started work on my next book, which is going to be with Candlewick, that I'm writing and illustrating. And then I'm working on a book just as an illustrator, and then I'm doing another one that's just me. So that's, I guess, the next 3 years.
Okay. And are they going to be addressing similar themes, ideas and issues, or are you just treating each book on its own merits as it arises?
So the last one that I've signed a contract for is going to be in the Julian is a Mermaid universe. I'm going to set it in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. I haven't quite worked out what the story is yet, and I don't know if it's going to be like a sequel, but it'll be the same sort of urban environment with the people that I see in my neighborhood every day. But I don't quite know what the story is.
That's
yet.
Fantastic, because of course this book came from a very specific impulse.
Yeah,
writing a second one is coming from a different.
Yeah, I don't want to. I didn't approach this as like I'm going to write a really woke children's book.
Yeah.
And it was just the story that I wanted to tell, and I don't think you can BS your way through that kind of thing. And I think that would be a pretty cynical way to approach it, actually, to try and make that my calling card.
Yeah. Jessica, I'd really like to thank you for joining us in the Reading Corner, giving us some insight into where Julian is a Mermaid came from. It has been really fascinating talking to you and very uplifting, so thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.